Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Denise Hare, Professor of Economics at Reed, and I'm very happy to welcome you here today for the fourth installment in our series of Black History Month lectures and events. We are pleased to have Professor Glenn Loury as our guest lecturer today. Professor Loury jointly holds the titles of Merton P. Stoltz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. His scholarly work has contributed to a variety of areas in applied microeconomic theory, including welfare economics, game theory, industrial organization, natural resource economics, and the economics of income distribution. Over 200 of Loury's essays and reviews on racial inequality and social policy have appeared in influential journals in the United States and abroad. Loury holds a BA in mathematics from Northwestern University and a PhD in economics from MIT. His most recent book is Ethnicity, Social Mobility, and Public Policy, Comparing the U.S. and the U.K. Professor Loury will talk today on Obama is No King, Reflections on Presidential Politics and the Black Prophet Tradition. Please join me in welcoming Professor Glenn Loury.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Reed College. Great pleasure indeed. In breaking through the skin color barrier in American politics, does Barack Hussein Obama bring with him a distinctive African-American moral vision? Does he somehow embody an alternate version of American history? That is the question I wish to address this afternoon. At the president's inauguration, the soaring closing prayer by the Reverend Joseph Loury, the benediction, had the new president nodding and tapping his foot as that famed black preacher, former leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Council, exalted the humble in the official story, America's minorities, blacks, brown, yellow, and red, and humbled the exalted by hoping that, quote, white will embrace what is right, close quote. That was the inauguration. This prayer nearly stole the show on Inauguration Day, confirming for many the glow of blessing on a new era. Well, have we in fact entered a new era? More pointedly, does the election of Barack Obama constitute some kind of fulfillment of Martin Luther King's famous dream? I think not. I'm going to argue in this lecture that the prophetic tradition of critical political thought and faith-based moral witness out of which Martin Luther King Jr. emerged and which he embodied is radically at odds with President Obama's exercise of the powers of his office and with his rhetoric concerning the moral significance of his ascendancy. For the tradition of social criticism that emerged over the generations from the sufferings of the slaves and gathered strength from the unrequited hopes of the freedmen is a tradition that has always been keenly aware of the moral ambiguity of the American founding. And yet no American politician, not even one as gifted at oratory as President Barack Hussein Obama, can afford to give public voice to such critical skepticism about the American project. But it is absolutely essential that such public voices critical of the claims of American moral exceptionalism be heard. Before I move to this argument, let me start by acknowledging the truly historic nature of Obama's election and the powerful hope for the possibilities for real change that he brought into office. It is often said that the United States is a country defined not by kinship, ethnicity, religion, or tribal connection, but by ideas about freedom, democracy, and the self-evident truths that all persons are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, to quote Jefferson. Another plain fact, too often forgotten, is that America is, always has been, and always will be a nation of immigrants. So in November of 2008, this nation of immigrants elected a son of Africa, a black man whose father had been born in Kenya and who went by the name Barack Hussein Obama, to be our 44th president. Historic hardly begins to describe how momentous, how remarkable, how improbable is President Obama's achievement. From now on, whenever my European friends complain to me about the flaws of American society, and they are many, I can respond by saying, no, America's not perfect, but please, could you show me your black president? Furthermore, I must say that as an African-American man who grew to maturity on Chicago's South Side in the 1960s and who was inspired by the words and deeds of Martin Luther King Jr., I couldn't help but feel a sense of personal joy at Obama's triumph in that election 3 years ago. Something profound happened in America. Of this, there can be no doubt. Also, I will confess something else to you. I was one of those cynics who didn't believe it was possible, who thought that the audacity of hope was just an empty phrase. Even as I witnessed millions of believers rallying around this cause, even as I saw people of all races bending themselves to this historic task, even as I observed the vast increase in voter registration in African American communities and amongst the young all across the land, I nevertheless remained doubtful. It didn't seem possible to me that the deep structures of American power would permit the ascent of this son of Africa and America to its pinnacle. But I was wrong, thank God. So, notwithstanding the somewhat caustic nature of some of the remarks to come, I celebrate the fact that America has elected this eloquent and brilliant young black man, this representative of the Southside neighborhoods that I have known so well, this usurper of power from a complacent establishment, this proponent of change. I celebrate that he's been elected as President of the United States. Whenever I reflect on this fact, I want to shout hallelujah. Still, that said, I will also tell you that I worry about what Obama's personal success could imply for the future of the black prophetic tradition. Moreover, I am skeptical in the extreme about the claims of this President of the United States, who happens to be an African American, to that tradition, to being connected to that tradition, to having come out of that tradition. I speak here not about his personal views as a black man or as a Christian believer or whatever, but rather about his role as the occupant of a very special and very powerful office with all of the awesome responsibilities which that entails. I rather doubt that these are commensurate matters at all, the black prophetic tradition on the one hand and the exercise of executive power at the top of the American government on the other. I rather doubt that they are denominated even in the same units of currency, so to speak. They are about different things. One of them is sacred, and the other is profane. That is, I doubt whether the black prophetic tradition articulates at all well with the exercise of power in the office of the American presidency. Now, what, you'll be asking yourself, do I mean by the black prophetic tradition? And how does Obama's success risk fracturing it? I'll get there. But to begin to see where I'm going, let me just offer up a couple of quotations from speeches given by one by Martin Luther King Jr. himself in 1967 and the other by Barack Hussein Obama in 2009. First, here's Obama in Oslo accepting the 2009 Nobel Peace Prize. I quote him: "We must begin by acknowledging the hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations, acting individually or in concert, will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in this same ceremony years ago." Quoting King now, Obama: "Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones." Close quote of King. Continuing with Obama: "As someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life work, I am living testimony to the moral force of nonviolence. I know there is nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and in the lives of Gandhi and King." I go on quoting Obama from the Oslo speech. "But as a head of state sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their example alone. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism. It is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason. And then a little bit later in the speech, Obama says this: but the world must remember that it is not simply international institutions, not just treaties and declarations that brought stability to a post-World War II world. Whatever mistakes we have made, the plain fact is this: the United States of America has helped underwrite global security for more than 6 decades with the blood of our citizens and the strength of our arms, close quote. That's Obama accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo in 2009. And here's Martin Luther King at the Riverside Church in New York City denouncing the Vietnam War in 1967, quoting King: as if the weight of such a commitment to the life and health of America were not enough, another burden of responsibility was placed upon me in 1964. And I cannot forget that the Nobel Prize for Peace was also a commission to work harder than I had ever worked before for the brotherhood of man. This is a calling that takes me beyond national allegiances. But even if it were not present, I would yet have to live with the meaning of my commitment to the ministry of Jesus Christ. To me, the relationship of this ministry to the making of peace is so obvious that I sometimes marvel at those who ask me why I am speaking against the war. Could it be that they do not know that the good news was meant for all men, for communist and capitalist, for their children and ours, for black and for white, for revolutionary and conservative? Have they forgotten that my ministry is in obedience to the one who loved his enemies so fully that he died for them? What then can I say to the Viet Cong, or to Castro, or to Mao, as a faithful minister of this one? Can I threaten them with death, or must I not share with them my life? King goes on: this I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond our nation's self-defined goals and positions. We are called to speak for the weak, for the voiceless, for victims of our nation, and for those it calls enemy. For no document from human hands can make these humans any less our brother. Close quote. One is Martin Luther King, the prophet, and the other is Barack Obama, the president. One is engaged in a sacred mission of moral and prophetic criticism. The other is engaged in a profane mission of electoral politics and global power. They are oil and water. They don't mix. The president is not confused about that, but many of us, perhaps even some sitting in this room, are. So, here you can see the 2 greatest African American leaders of the second half of the 20th century, or of the 21st century, however you want to slice that, as they address themselves to the gravest public question of our time, that of war and peace. My, what a difference 40 years can make. King is a black American prophet standing squarely within a tradition of social criticism. Obama is not. The difference matters. Now, what do I mean by the black prophetic tradition? I see that tradition as embodying an outsider's and underdog's critical view about the national narrative of the United States of America. Adherents of the tradition simply haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. It is, to be concrete, a historical counter-narrative. One, for example, that sees the dispossession of the native people of the North American continent as the great historic crime that it was. One that looks back on the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in which tens of thousands of human beings were incinerated in the blink of an eye, in the bat of an eye, with feelings of horror and shame. This tradition insists that American democracy, which of course has always been a complicated political compact, often serving the interests of the powerful at the expense of the weak, an insistence that it live up to the true meaning of our espoused civic creed. It is this tradition and understanding that struggle, resistance, and protest are the only ways to bring this about. Power concedes nothing without demand. Isn't that what Frederick Douglass tells us? And this tradition embodies the recognition that even in the late 20th and in the early 21st century, America has yet fully to live up to the true meaning of its espoused creed. The Black prophetic tradition is anti-triumphalist vis-a-vis America's role in the world, and it is deeply suspicious of the city on a hill, an exceptional nation rhetoric. Deeply suspicious of the rhetoric of self-congratulation to which American politicians, including Barack Obama, are so often inclined. It is a doggedly critical assessment of what Americans do, an assessment that sympathizes in a deep way with the struggles of those who are dispossessed. The stateless Palestinians in the Middle East today, for example, or blacks at the southern tip of Africa 3 decades ago. This is a tradition of moral witness within America's historical experience that I associate with the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century and the civil rights movement of the 20th century. It is a tradition that views collateral damage, where civilians are killed in U.S. military operations, not simply as an unavoidable cost of doing business. How are we going to get an omelet if we don't break some of those eggs? In the modern world, but rather as a deeply problematic offense against a righteousness toward which we ought to aspire. What I am calling the Black prophetic tradition reflects a universal theory of freedom, one that with a strong anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-militarist tilt. What then is President Obama's relationship to this tradition as I set it out? What in this regard are we entitled to expect from him? Frankly, I have concluded that as president, his connection to this great moral tradition is tenuous at best. And more crucially, I have concluded that we would be foolish to expect much at all from him in this vein. That's my principal point. President of the United States is an office. The office has its own imperatives. Quite apart from whatever an individual's personal beliefs might be who occupies the office. When one is sitting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one is told that a Predator drone operation against a putatively terrorist operative in the tribal regions of Pakistan awaits one's authorization, then one has to make that call. Such a moment as that is no time to be quoting King, and it's no time to be invoking Douglass, or to be talking about the tradition of critical political thought which has been nurtured by black people in America for centuries. Rather, at a time like that, one has to decide if one is going to kill the people or one is not going to kill them. My view is that the person who is the commander-in-chief of the United States of America, regardless of his individual biography and certainly regardless of the color of his skin, when placed in that position and forced to carry out such acts, needs to be viewed with clear-eyed realism for who and what they are. Namely, in the context of the example at hand, the commander-in-chief of the largest military force in the history of human experience. Such a person ought not to be viewed through a rose-tinted glass with some romantic and unrealistic narrative. So the question I wish to pose is this: what does the tradition of black protest and struggle in America have to do with the exercise of the powers of office in the American presidency? And as I've suggested, I expect that the answer is very little at all. Moreover, I believe it is a serious political error to think anything otherwise. Of course, I could be wrong about this, but I remain to be convinced. I am a skeptic about this kind of talk in reference to President Obama based on the fact of his blackness. Romantic idealists argue that surely his biography, even his skin color, somehow informs the man who is the president. But for me, this merely shifts the question to an inquiry about the extent to which personality and individual moral commitment can exert real leverage over the exercise of such an office as the American presidency. Here's an analogy to ponder. A woman rises to become the chief executive officer of a large corporation, ExxonMobil, Bank of America. What real difference should we expect this to make for matters like the environment or economic equity or corporate governance? At the end of the day, that job is about making money for the shareholders, period. It's not about anything else. It's not about saving the planet or integrating the workforce or providing child care to struggling families or ending poverty. It's about making money for the shareholders. Now, this woman, with her unique experiences and inspiring biography, she will be a wonderful role model, and she may approach the exercise of her responsibilities in office with a slightly different intonation, a slightly different style than would a man. But she won't be chief executive officer for very long if she fails to continue to make profits for the shareholders. The leverage she has for doing good in the world is pretty small relative to the imperative of sustaining her company's financial performance at a high level. Likewise, if someone is the chief executive officer and commander-in-chief of the largest military in the world, if someone has an officer close by with an electronic device, as the U.S. president does, allowing one to signal special codes to submarines at sea armed with multiply targeted warheads, authorizing the release of these weapons so as to incinerate tens or hundreds of thousands of persons, if someone's in that position, then the imperative of that office is, well, to make profits for the shareholders. Put plainly, the imperatives of the office in the position of the American presidency are basically to further the interest of the American imperial project, not to criticize that project. Oh, you didn't know there was an American imperial project? If one were to engage in too much criticism, then one won't be running the show for very long, will one? Yet, if the history of blacks in America teaches us anything, it is that the American imperial project must be criticized. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood here. I'm not attacking President Obama, the man. I've already said that I admire him. If you care, my assessment of Barack Obama, the man, given what I know about him, the books of his I've read, the speeches I've heard, and so forth, is that he is compassionate, that he is possessed of a deep historic sensibility, and that left to his own devices, I'm pretty confident saying that he would stand on the right side of history in on most questions. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, it's at least arguable that the rise of Barack Obama represents one way in which that moral arc is indeed bending toward justice. He is someone, I think it's fair to say, with more room within his own philosophy for concern about the dispossessed than anyone who's held the office. He is, I would reckon, aware of the imperfections of American democracy and of the inflated character of some of the rhetoric that he himself must use as a matter of political expediency. But the main point that I'm making here is that the office has its own imperatives. And that's the thing which those of us who have been clamoring for change and who so far have been sorely disappointed must take the measure of.